Is there more to this world than what meets the eye? People have pondered this very simple question for millennia, and throughout history, the scripture of numerous religions have provided them with an answer. But for some people, such simply isn't enough to sate them, requiring something more direct in order to comprehend the spiritual realm. Today, I'll be telling you one such story, for better or worse. Hey you! Have you ever wondered what happens when an atheist takes a psychedelic substance and comes face to face with demonic entities from another dimension? Yeah, me too. So let's find out. This serial killer looking gentleman here is a friend of mine called Girold, or at least that's what I'll always call him. I first met Girold back in late 2019 when I was playing a game called World of Warcraft Classic. We played alongside each other for a while, and what struck me about Girold was that, unlike most World of Warcraft players, the vast majority of which are usually boring antisocial neckbeards, Girold was actually a very interesting guy. He was an Englishman, like myself, however I couldn't help but notice that he was, well, never actually in England. This is because Girold was what's known as a digital nomad, aka someone who works remotely, and thus, not being constrained to a specific location, can live and work wherever they so desire. Girold, after becoming tired of menial employment, went on to set up his own miniatures business, of which would prove to be very successful. And from this meant that he could do his job wherever he was in the world, so long as he had a laptop with the Blender modelling software on it. And thus, rather than staying in rainy old England, was instead free to travel the world while working instead. And Girold has travelled to many places around the world, even to places that you probably wouldn't necessarily expect.
I suppose I should give things a personal element by talking about how I became a nomad. I suppose I just had got into like a typical sort of normie lifestyle. After uni, I worked a job that I got fired from at my university. Got fired for incompetence, was just completely mentally checked out, did not give a toss. And then I was in the public sector in a job where it was much more difficult to get fired. Essentially, if I just kept my head down, I could subsist there. But it was a completely alienating and soul-destroying job. And I, in a sort of destructive way, I wanted to do crazy shit. So I was bouncing off the walls. So the first trip I organised was a trip to North Korea. I convinced my best friend to go with me, and we went on a tour there. I was so interested as a teenager, like in the Soviet Union and the Cold War and communism.
Israel. Romantic. Order. Abala.
Political tour being in the sense that obviously the itinerary concerned itself with political things, and I thought it would be an opportunity to ask them about, Juche ideology and to what extent it's informed by Marxism and so on. That was like, jumping in at the deep end, because it was just a sort of YOLO, I don't give a fuck kind of thing. I then did my next trip. I was like, well, I want to see the Soviet Union. So I went to Chernobyl, which was a really stupid thing in retrospect now, because I understand if someone... I went there on the logic that, Chernobyl is a time capsule, right? It's a Soviet city that was just left alone. But the thing is, if you want to see a Soviet city, you can just go to much of the Eastern Bloc. It's all still there and still intact in that original form. But I didn't know that at the time. I think I was quite naive. And I sort of got infected. And what am I trying to say in so many words, I guess, is that I can't stay put. I have wanderlust, and I was just ready to go traveling.
And so on paper, you'd think that Girold was kind of living the dream life, right? Financially independent, traversing the world, eating great food, and of course, women are all over you. Well, maybe not in his case. But either way, this is the kind of life that most people would die to have, right?
Without exception, maybe some people are being polite, but without exception, honest to God, every person I tell about it is like, expresses some degree of envy. Says, oh my God, that's amazing, or that's so cool, or whatever. Like, or even to the point you feel jealous. There might be some self-disparaging joke about, oh God, I wish I could get away. Or why did you come back? That sort of thing. Like, it's because the nomad lifestyle is essentially something to aspire to, because it is, obviously people that have like kids, there are still dedicated family people out there. To them, it sounds nice, but I think they wouldn't want to give up what they've got. They know that if they have a kid and they're raising them right, they have to stay put. But to a lot of people, it's the freedom, because nobody likes being a wage slave, right? So it is really a goal to aspire to.
But my overall takeaway from getting to know Girold on more than just a surface level was that despite the fact that on paper he was supposedly living this dream life that so many others envy, deep down it was clear that he wasn't really happy with it.
I was very disillusioned by the kinds of people I was meeting, namely the other travellers. So, to offer one anecdote, my housemate, the Dutch guy, and he was nice enough, and we got along, but he was an unashamed sex tourist. And all of his free time, his entire rationale for being there was dedicated to Tinder, working out, and fucking. And he didn't care if they'd been sleeping with other men and stuff. I was like, what is there to them? Like, can you talk to them? Do you respect them as people? And he said, no, they're just hunks of meat. And when he wants an interesting conversation, he talks to a man. And it was just such a strange paradox to me that someone who can make it their immediate, all-consuming goal to pursue sex with people they don't think of as any better than me, you know? Like, so we would often, like, if there was an evening when neither of us had anything to do, we would just sit out in our house and just talk into the night. And I would ask him about, like, whether he doesn't want something more, whether he doesn't feel a call to responsibility. Because that's what was eating me up. This sense that I had to aspire to something more, that I was feeling empty because I was living a lifestyle wherein I'd rejected any and all responsibility, and that I needed to find purpose through responsibility.
One of the things that Girold would primarily interrogate me on was, of course, matters of religion. Mainly, wanting to understand why or how it was that I became religious myself, as from observing such decadent behaviour, he began to respect religious values, but had great difficulty in believing in the idea of there being a god. He was sort of an atheist in limbo.
It's quite interesting how any atheist and any individualist can sort of, with some hubris that I guess is more apparent when you're young, when you're a teenager or young adult, feel that you actually have a unique insight into things, that you yourself are an individual, perhaps with some original viewpoints. In my own case, I look back on myself and it's hard not to see it all as very predictable and stereotypical, but I was born into a non-religious household. My mother loosely believed in like a god, but wasn't practicing, didn't go to church, didn't really, teach me any religious values. My father was an actual atheist, but they did send me to a Christian primary school, Church of England to be specific, and I was baptized, so I was exposed to religion, but I think in the same way that a lot of British people are, wherein we used to joke that people that went to my primary school, you go to a Church of England school and it produces atheists. Like, the invariable result of having a religious education is that you come out an atheist, and I suppose that's just a result of the state that the Church of England is in nowadays, really. It's almost a half-hearted attempt to bring people into religiosity, because they're so terrified of their diminished status and compounding that further that it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy wherein they are ever more accommodating and ever less stringent in what they require of people. And I don't think they understand there is a call to order. There were times in my life where I had a loose conception of God. I remember believing in him as a little kid, but as I got older and I felt I could rationalize and reason, it just seemed stupid. There was no God, because I felt like I used to joke, why aren't there dinosaurs in the Bible? Like, even as a little kid, I remember that. I asked my RE teacher about why there aren't any dinosaurs in the Bible. But I think in a sort of typical, let's say, NPC-esque fashion, growing up in a society where religion was not in the zeitgeist meant that I myself did not become religious. All that is to say, I was an atheist.
I told Girold that, look, I can go in depth on scripture endlessly. But when in that mindset, a mindset that I know myself, he would only treat it with the same severity as reading Harry Potter. And that from my experience, the most effective way for an atheist in limbo to embrace spirituality isn't to ponder matters of the invisible, but on the contrary, the visible. I told him that the phenomenon that made my mind regain a sense of spirituality, I believe, was researching into psychedelics such as DMT, and listening to the unusual experiences that such people had with them. Thus, I recommended that he should go and watch my production on such, known as DMT Realms and Entities, and so he could tell me what he thinks. What I didn't remember at the time of making this recommendation is that myself and Girold had very different means of operation. As whereas I tend to observe, research and ponder, Girold is much more hands-on. And so as soon as he had finished watching the production, he instantly made it his mission to have such an experience himself. And it just so happened that he couldn't have been in a more convenient place for such, as at the time of watching, he was stationed in no other than Colombia, South America. Which, for those who don't know, is one of the few places in the world where the consumption of such psychedelics was readily available to tourists. So I guess you could say that it was really kind of like destiny.
So to come back to me in Colombia, I was supposed to stay there another month, making it 3 months total. I'd been there 2 months up to that point, and then go to Argentina for 3 months, but I decided to cut everything short and to go back to Britain. Thinking I probably would never return to Latin America again, and knowing these opportunities were out there, I decided that I should look up ayahuasca retreats before I leave, because I'd always been curious about hallucinogens, that sort of thing. And I've always been very interested in my own state of mind and knowing myself and self-mastery. So obviously the idea of like hallucinogenics was interesting for pursuing that avenue. I will say up front that I had watched Alex's videos on DMT, so unfortunately I can't say I went in there as a blank slate. So I found this ayahuasca day where they would drive us out to a shaman's house, and we would drink this thick black tea, which they call a medicine. They told us that anything we see will be something that exists within us ourselves. That it's a medicine about confronting yourself. So the people administering it were very keen that we'd be under the impression that we're more delving into our own psyche than anything spiritual. I think the shaman, who was surprisingly young, like I can't say I'm sure this was a real religious figure, but this shaman seemed to live there with his family. And out back of the house, they had erected like a corrugated iron roof with wooden pallets laid underneath with pillows and sort of a thick bedding mat laid on each one. I should say that it was a dirt floor. Well, not dirt, I guess sand. Sorry, it was sand, but what they would do is if someone vomited, they would just bury it in the sand, so pretty filthy. They gave us the tea, and we were told it would take about 40 minutes to come into effect, so participants just walked around, chatted a bit. But I picked a place that was by the fire, and I picked that for spiritual reasons. I thought, well, fire is something that seems to have had like a central place in human spirituality. So I lay down next to the fire, thinking I could look into the fire. As I did that, the back of this house and the roof above it became like very warm. I could see the colors becoming richer. But if I focused again or started thinking, it snapped out of it, like straight back to reality. And I'll say now that this is a defining thing I noticed about ayahuasca. You do hallucinate, but you're never out of reality. You can still see everything around you. It's more what you see is projected on top of what you're seeing. And the way that things distort, let's say the static objects in your vision, the way they distort is immediately undone the moment you like move your eyes or move your head, look around. So it's very interesting in that respect, compared to like full-on DMT, which I think is a hallucination you can't escape from, as I understand. If you close your eyes, you see things. I could see my environment, it was changing. But that's when I realized, okay, this is doing something.
One of the interesting things that people who undergo a psychedelic experience often report is this idea of a presence that you can interact with. And that's exactly what happened with Girold as well. On his trip, Girold was exposed to roughly 3 separate types of entities, of which each provide us with a unique revelation. First, the fire of impotent rage.
I think other people that have done hallucinogens or anything like ayahuasca or DMT will know what I'm saying. You don't hear a voice, it's more the thought appears in your own brain. You answer yourself, but the thought feels external. So I thought about cornerstones of faith, and the first question I asked was why do people suffer? I wanted to concentrate on suffering. Thinking about it, contemplating suffering, the logs in the fire that were in front of me started to change. And this will sound quite disturbing if I describe it. You have to understand this within the context of me feeling completely safe and quite removed from what I was seeing. But the logs in the fire became severed limbs, arms and legs, sort of just jutting out of this fire. And there was a set of legs that still had the trousers on them, or shorts, I guess. But they were burning away and exposing like blistering flesh underneath. And where the leg had its knee, the back of that knee had an eye in it that was looking at me. And I stared into that eye and I tried to use it as a sort of frame of reference. The severed limbs were sort of grey and green, but when I focused on the flames that were lapping at them and burning them, focusing on them made the red become a richer, more powerful color. And I perceived that they were coming from a grate under the fire. And the answer that was in my head was that suffering enables civilization. Suffering enables all of us to leave our lives. Basically, all of human existence is predicated on the suffering of others. There is always an unlucky few who must suffer. And as I was thinking about this, the fire felt very masculine. And I noticed like hands and movement under this grate. And what I understood looking at this was that this was like impotent rage. These were disaffected young men, the kind of toxic anger that you can sense coming off disillusioned, alienated men. Perhaps I've heard it said before that the majority of men who ever lived did not reproduce. It's like a symbol of the injustice that men have borne the brunt of suffering in human history in some respects. Sorry, I will come back to women later. This isn't going to be a misogynistic rant, but in the sense that, let's say, men die in wars, men build things, men go through horrible physical labor. And today, there are a lot of angry young men on the internet, I guess, and looking at this grate, the people underneath were the suffering men. But where they were was hell, and I realized that behind that grate, beyond it, was where everyone who was apart from God was. This is what this voice was telling me. But again, I wasn't scared. If anything, this was just very sort of interesting. I felt very, very at peace watching all this. Physically at peace, but I was rather distressed by the sudden awareness that hit me of just what percentage of people in all human history have suffered, essentially.
This vision of a sort of masculine rage can be seen as a revelation in numerous ways, but the specific concept of injustice, and specifically how men deal with being served an injustice, is a very fascinating one indeed. As in many ways, the Western world today is essentially an injustice factory, hence why so many find themselves in this state of fury. And there are no people more than those who are biologically programmed to fall victim to such anger than young men. The correct course of action is to not let one be consumed by such injustices, and instead rise above them, battling righteously to correct this satanic force at the heart of our civilization. But many can let such devils corrupt them, turning them from the great men they could be into nothing more than bitter boys, stuck in a victimized infantilism. And it is this circumstance, whereby men cut themselves away from the divine without even trying, that is likely what such a fire represents. Which leads us to the second entity encounter, the nihilistic jesters.
The fire was sort of bricked in, like the fire was contained by a ring of bricks, and those bricks and the floor around it sort of form flat surfaces. And in those surfaces, manically grinning Harlequin-esque faces appeared. And I remember one figure who I was particularly transfixed by, a very small, little, sort of hobbit-like creature was trying to reach out to me over one of the bricks, and he was snarling at me. These figures, we might say, were jesters. They had that air to them of manic, mischievous grinning, as I said, like they're mocking me. And it felt like the reason they were mocking me was because I was asking too many questions. I was treating this like some curious academic exercise. So I was thinking about suffering, like I said. I was so, like, up myself with that sort of thing. And this conclusion I came to, I became aware of the fact that trying to rationalize or anchor everything to reality and psychological causes, because I was still speculating to what extent I was like just witnessing parts of my own personality. This sort of rational thinking was the sort of thinking that motivated the damned souls and the red flame. Because as I said, it wasn't just impotent male rage I felt there, but also people that were severed from God, that never found spirituality, that the souls left behind. So I thought to myself, and in so doing acknowledged, that there is like a higher plane, let's just call it spirituality. There is something else that they've missed. And these jesters, these faces, smiled at me and started nodding very animatedly. Think like that Jack Nicholson gif where he's nodding, you know, like that. But then I thought to myself, God is real. And when I thought God, I was thinking Jehovah, the Abrahamic God. And that made them very angry. They started contorting and snarling. And like a bloody coward, I backtracked immediately and thought, okay, God's not God, but let's say the Abrahamic framework, that reality I've been brought up with. And they became more serene with that. And that's when the first warning sign I got, it wasn't severed corpses or anything like that, or the hell grate that made me worry, but I thought to myself, like, shit, these might be satanic entities that I'm interacting with right now.
A common thematic observation from those who have interacted with jesters is how they absolutely despise any semblance of order, care, or perhaps more importantly, God, as we so understand it. As seen here, they always seem to have an underlying agenda to make one feel nihilistic, as if nothing ever truly matters, and that everything is just one big joke, including, and some would say especially, the idea of the divine. Whatever these creatures are, it cannot be understated that they are perhaps the closest thing to a living embodiment of a blatant antidote to the Abrahamic worldview, and thus, indeed, satanic by proxy. Their mere presence alone often inspires immense fear, which may lead one to desire a refuge from such mental torment. Which brings us on finally to the third and final entity encounter, the mother and father.
That made me sort of lock down. I didn't want to engage with them, so I curled up on my pallet, and the way that felt was being an innocent child sort of curled up in on your own body and kind of floating. On this pallet, I felt very removed from everything. And as I curled up in this sort of childish way, I was looking at things other than these gestures, and I became aware that the flame was emitting a blue smoke. And while you're doing this ayahuasca experience, they're playing, hippie music at you. So it was just on a very serene sort of track, and this smoke was moving in a way I can only describe as sort of sensual, very feminine, sort of twisting and flowing. And I again started thinking about suffering, but the presence that was there and that was answering me was very maternal and very compassionate and understanding. And I was told that I can feel regret, I can feel sadness for the suffering of others and people who don't make it, but I have to understand that we're in this together, like as a species, that we as a race are collectively on the same journey. And some people will fall by the wayside, but their sacrifice is made to allow others among us to get there. This is not what I thought at the time, but saying this now makes me think to myself about maybe sperm. Think about how many of them bloody die just so one can succeed. Anyway, I took solace from that this idea that we have a commonality to us, that we're all walking the same path, that everybody goes through the same existential issues, the same crises of faith, moral demands that are placed on us. And when I thought to myself, this must be the Blue Lady, the jesters' faces disappeared, and the color palette that I was taking in shifted again more to blue, and the stones around the fire and the logs within it shifted from being corpses and jesters into being a sort of blue, purple, mosaic kind of pattern. I had come to the conclusion that the previous entities were likely malevolent. There was more ambiguity with the Blue Lady because I cannot overstate how serene and peaceful and sort of loved I felt. It was like being in your mother's arms, I suppose, in that respect. And I felt like I could ask her questions, that I now had some sort of control. And as I thought about all the things that I'd wanted to learn from this trip, I thought about my own mother and my father, who I don't have the best of relationships with, and toward whom I have some resentment. But I have a lot of faults that remind me of my mother. I would describe my character as generally quite feminine. And I know that I would say that my mother has been quite egoistical or even narcissistic, and those are faults I've also felt myself. When I thought about this, how the faults I identify in my mother, my father, and in myself, the Blue Lady told me that my parents are just people, and people are all walking a common path, a path which many of us fail on, and that I shouldn't feel anger towards them, but be happy that I've identified where they failed me, and that now I can see how that's affected my own development. And I should only, if I feel anything toward them, it should only be sorrow for their failures, for how that's hurt them, but to remember that they're doing their best. My surroundings were very palatial. Seeing these mosaic patterns in the fire and how beautiful everything was, it made me understand that the mother, or the Blue Lady, whatever you want to call her, reveled in aesthetics and beauty. And that was when I came to this conclusion, a rather Muslim-esque conclusion, I suppose, that the whole purpose of aesthetics, let's say art and music, is to approximate a spiritual experience through cheap and easy means, we might say. And that's when I, in that moment, understood why I think Muslims don't like music, why Muslims say music is haram, because what I was doing in taking ayahuasca even was an attempt to have a spiritual experience that's forced, that's easy to access. And music and all art outside of that is another way of trying to achieve that. It's a sort of a corruption. And this is when I started feeling a little bit worried, and like the Blue Lady herself was a malicious entity, because I was so peaceful and so contented that I had this sort of idea that I could live an aesthetic, I don't know how to say that right, aesthetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C lifestyle, where I might just meditate on philosophical questions, which sounds nice to begin with. You're like, oh, I want to contemplate mysticism, I want to contemplate religion. But from that thought path, I arrived at ideas that this therefore justified my deficiencies as a man. I don't think I could raise a family. I'm not sure I've got that in me. I don't know if I could provide for someone. I'm not stable. I'm rather trying to address those and live a proper family life. It felt like she was urging me towards ideas of living like a mystic, or that we are all part of a common life force or entity anyway, so it doesn't really matter what I do. As long as the rest of the species is successful, I'm not personally accountable to anything. I gave myself to chaos previously in my life. I was a very erratic, self-indulgent lifestyle. And as I pondered on that, the Blue Lady was making excuses for me. Like she was justifying my faults, like she wouldn't hold me to account, in the way that like an unhealthily smothering mother will never hear a bad word said about her little boy or whatever. And she was putting this idea in my head that I could be a celibate, wise man who contemplates the mysteries of life. And that did appeal to me. But in appealing to me, I realized that I was feeling so warm and loved and comfortable, and like I wanted to stay forever. Like that could be my life. Like I could just, I can afford it. I can stay. I could do ayahuasca and things. I could stay in just a stupor with this lady for the rest of my life, like a wise man in a cave or something. But I realized that a man who does that is abdicating from society and abdicating all responsibility in the temporal world. And this is basically what a drug addict would be thinking. And this, I've mentioned already before about feelings of healthy self-disgust, but this was a moment where I reflected to myself, you're lying on a pallet on a dirt floor. You are not in palatial surroundings, Have some self-awareness. She's seducing you. And at this moment, the lady asked me to think once more about my feminine nature. Maybe I have a feminine soul, and that's why I fail to be a man. Like I can't live up to a man's responsibility. And maybe I'm a woman. She asked me that. She said, maybe you're a woman in a man's body. And that got me that was like the moment where I understood unambiguously, right, this is the satanic entity that I'm dealing with here. It's sucking me in because these demons, if they are demons, but if they are demons, they can't reach you, they can't access you, so the way they corrupt you is by being as appealing as possible. But their ultimate goal is to separate you from God. And that made me very defiant. And this feeling of self-disgust I had, the voice of my conscience, never materialized to me as an entity, but in focusing that on that and deciding that I was going to stand in opposition to these things I had seen, I had this feeling that there was like watching me, this white entity, like a white light. Didn't see it, it's just something in my thinking, in my brain told me that's the color it would have. But this entire affair was so distasteful to it, it wanted no involvement. It was watching me and waiting for me to come out. But that part of me that was attuned to it knew what it would say, knew what it wanted. And this was an entity that I called the Father. And around this time, they offered us a second cup of ayahuasca. And this is where I stopped seeing coherent things. And my memory no longer really becomes a linear recollection, but instead, literally, I wound up thrashing about on the floor for an hour and a half. Literally, I was just spasming on the floor as I had this battle in me between this father and this feminine side. And I can only therefore really relate to you the impressions I had from it coming out of it, which was the female entity I was dealing with was sort of like an untempered woman. It sounds so bad, so misogynistic, but I just mean to say, like, some of the worst chaotic attributes that a woman can express are when she doesn't have family, duty, or purpose. In the same way as a man does, I suppose. A man can act like an animal, a lustful, debased animal. This feminine entity, even if it was malicious, still represented a part of the human condition, because within her realm, if we'll call it that, were aesthetics, art, chaos. And remember that chaos is itself a creative energy. I think that, I'm very much drawn to order. I'm very much drawn to a monotheistic religion that requires duty from me. If you take that to its extreme, you too become a sort of an automaton who can only drive himself too hard and drive others away, I suppose. Orderly people, if we think in terms of extremes, orderly people who give themselves to order lack creativity. and are very pragmatic, rooted in the ground. They're not imaginative. But then if you think about the most creative people you know, your Van Goghs of the world, they're also deeply troubled, often depressed. Like, those are two unhealthy extremes. But I had this sensation that while it seems like the obvious answer from, like, let's say an Abrahamic point of view is that I should reject the chaos and do what the Father says, I had this thought of my own agency, which was that I have to integrate these two parts of myself. That I didn't know what this meant, and I'm still not entirely sure, but this conclusion that kept ringing around my head was ego death. You need to kill your ego. You need to rehabilitate these two sides, bring them back together, and kill your own ego and, like, ascend above this. Become an integrated man. The reason I was spasming around was because there was a conflict being fought inside me wherein this woman, the Father, wounded her, angered her, saddened her, but she was submissive to him. He was powerful and yet unsympathetic, callous even. So he could come in and he could make his orderly proclamation that she in turn felt wronged. And being aware of them both and the fundamental conflict, let's say, between the genders, or between order and chaos, I was at the understanding that this is still a part of you have to love, this feminine part. Like, each needs the other. The man is rigid and unimaginative. The maternal side is compassionate and loving and creative. But at her worst, she enables lies. She self-justification, self-deception, and an assertion of false competency, which has been a problem in my life. I market myself to myself and others as being more competent than I really am, and I have a tremendous capacity for self-deception. Whereas the Father at his worst, it's, as I said, wrathful, lacking empathy, lacking compassion. But I felt like in a healthy person, those two still love each other, and they're different, but each needs the other.
This mother figure clearly represents an isolated femininity, beautiful, calm and soothing, but also making excuses for failure, promoting easy ways out, and thus allowing chaos to build in the name of avoiding necessary conflict. Meanwhile, this father figure clearly represents an isolated masculinity, harsh, cold and rigid, but also making no excuses for failure, forcing one to understand the reality, and thus preventing chaos to build by engaging in necessary conflict. And this is the fundamental reason why males and females exist, as a collective counterbalance of the two extremes of nature that roughly results in the middle. But when both are isolated from the other, they are nothing but flawed characters, and are thus utterly useless. After such a trip had concluded, Girold was asked to write down anything that he could possibly remember, and these were the lessons that he learned.
I'm now going to read the notes that I wrote in the car. So this is about 15 minutes after finishing the trip, driving back to the town. I just wrote these as bullet points, and these were the conclusions I came to. So, first one was, order is masculine, chaos is feminine. Chaos is the absence of purpose. Purpose and competence are masculine traits. Men and women are a team. They temper each other. A man gives a woman security, a rock, and purpose. A woman moderates him and nurtures the family, reminds him of the important things and supports him in trying times. Aesthetics are chaotic. They include art and music. The ultimate conclusion of chaos is to languish and to be purposeless. You enable yourself with lies and fictions. One of the greatest sins you can commit is unearned accomplishment. That is, achieving through cheap means or implying that you have achieved anything significant without actually doing the work. Ayahuasca is an example of this. Anyone who is walking down a similar path to myself might well sin, and so long as they come to the right destination in the end, God will forgive you. I am convinced of that. As a final conclusion, I suppose I'll say, do I regret doing what I did, and do I recommend it to others? I don't recommend it, and I don't regret it. I think it is, in my case, it was like a weapon of last resort. I already was on a path of faith that I wanted to shove. However, if what I dealt with really were demons, if that really was a spiritual experience, then I obviously tainted myself in doing it. So let it be said that when I finished this little ritual, I felt like I had sinned. And that's why I'm not sure I can really recommend it to people. If you are genuinely spiritually bent, I don't think God's happy with you doing this. I don't know if that's forgivable, because there is the possibility that you are cavorting with literal hellspawn and using a cheat code to access something you should have to work your socks off to experience. So think long and hard before you think about doing this if you're spiritually motivated. If you're just some person who's wanting to live a life rich in experiences and self-gratification, your thinking might be different, but I'll leave it there.
It's absolutely fascinating, and I'd like to thank Girold for retelling this trip to you all, and hopefully, dear viewer, you got as much out of it as he did. As ever since this trip, Girold has ceased travelling in order to return to the UK and attempt to build a life of responsibility. And I wanted him to tell this story to you all, not just because it's incredibly interesting, but because there's a lesson to be learned here for everyone. As men, no matter how much money, luxury, or freedom that we have, cannot live a life of true meaning without responsibility. And this nihilistic cloud that hovers above most of us in the modern era is a symptom of being too obsessed with the material and not enough with the spiritual. And while, naturally, no one should jump headfirst into such realms, dare they go mad from such an experience, there is more to this world than what meets the eye, and that unless those disconnected from this vital part of what it means to be human come to terms with such a fact, they may never, ever reach nirvana, and may well be doomed to the fire. I'll see you next time.